When I moved into my new neighborhood, I thought I had finally found peace. The lake shimmered in the morning sun, the air smelled of pine, and the sound of birds replaced the noise of city traffic. It felt perfect until I met Karen. Karen was the head of the HOA, a woman who believed she ruled the neighborhood like a queen sitting on a lawn chair throne. She had sharp eyes that never missed a detail and a voice that could carry across the entire street. Every morning, she marched down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, inspecting mailboxes, fences, lawns, and even the way people parked their cars. For the first few months, I stayed out of her way. I kept my yard trimmed, my porch clean, and waved politely whenever she passed. She gave me that tight smile that wasn't really a smile and moved on. I thought maybe I would be one of the lucky ones. Then came the fence. The wooden fence around my backyard had been weathered by time. The paint had peeled away, the boards looked tired. So one weekend I decided to give it new life. I bought a few gallons of soft cedar brown paint and spent 2 days working in the sun, brushing away the old look and giving it warmth again. The moment I finished, I stood back proud. The fence looked fresh and beautiful, and I felt like I had truly made the house mine. But the next morning I woke to the sound of knocking, sharp and impatient. I opened the door, and there she was. Karen in her wide sun hat and floral blouse, clutching her clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "Good morning," she said in a tone that didn't sound like one. "I noticed you painted your fence yesterday." I nodded, still smiling, proud of my work. She squinted at me and said that color is not approved by the HOA. I blinked. I didn't even know there were approved colors for fences. Before I could speak, she added, "You'll be receiving a fine in the mail." Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking like a judge passing sentence. I stood there speechless. A fine for painting a fence. I checked the HOA handbook and saw nothing about fence colors, only that they should be well maintained. Mine was perfect. Still, the notice came 2 days later. $300 for violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. I refused to pay. I took pictures of the fence, the handbook, and sent an email to the HOA board. Karen replied within the hour, stating that as president her decision was final. That night, I sat on my porch thinking. The moonlight glowed softly on the new fence, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. But I also knew I couldn't let it go. Not this time. So the next morning I called the county housing office and asked for a property and building compliance inspection. If my fence broke any rule, I wanted it verified. If not, I wanted proof to stop her once and for all. A week later, the inspector arrived. A tall man with calm eyes and a clipboard much like hers. Karen saw the white county truck pull into my driveway and came marching over immediately. She demanded to know what was going on, her tone full of false authority. The inspector simply smiled and said, "Routine property inspection, ma'am." Karen crossed her arms, watching closely as he examined the fence, taking measurements and photos. I stood quietly, letting him do his job. After a few minutes, he turned to me and said, "Your fence meets all county and HOA regulations. There are no violations here whatsoever." He looked at Karen, then added, "Actually, it's one of the best maintained fences I've seen in this area." Karen's face froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The inspector handed me a copy of the report and walked back to his truck. Karen stood there, pale as chalk, unable to move. The silence that followed was sweeter than any victory speech I could have given. The neighborhood had started to gather around, watching the scene unfold. For once, no one sided with her. They whispered quietly, shaking their heads. I thanked the inspector and turned to Karen. She looked smaller, somehow her power slipping through her fingers like sand. I said nothing, I just smiled, the same polite smile she had given me months ago. That evening I sat again on my porch, the sunset bathing the fence in gold. The air felt lighter, freer. For the first time since moving there, I felt like I belonged. But deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Karen didn't take humiliation well, and something in her eyes before she walked away told me she wasn't done yet. The next few days were strangely quiet. Karen didn't walk her usual patrol with the clipboard. No notes appeared on my door. No emails from the HOA filled my inbox. It almost felt peaceful. But that peace made me uneasy, because silence from Karen was never a good sign. Neighbors started talking. They whispered that Karen had been furious after the inspection. Some said she had called an emergency HOA meeting. Others claimed she was gathering complaints to get back at me another way. I kept tending to my garden, pretending not to care. But every time I saw her blinds shift or her shadow pass by the window, I knew she was watching. One afternoon, while I was planting flowers by the porch, I heard her voice behind me. "Good afternoon," she said sweetly, too sweetly. I turned and saw her standing there holding a printed document. "We have a new rule," she said, smiling thinly. "All exterior paint changes must now be pre-approved by the HOA board." I wiped my hands on my jeans and met her gaze. "So you made a new rule because you couldn't prove I broke the old one?" Her smile twitched for a second. "The board voted," she said firmly. "It's official now." I nodded slowly. Then I asked, "Did the board vote, or did you vote for yourself again?" Her face tightened, but she said nothing and turned to leave. I watched her walk back to her house, that familiar stiffness in her shoulders. Something told me this battle had just begun. A week later, I noticed something odd. A few of my neighbors began repainting their fences. Different shades of brown, tan, and even light gray. They told me quietly that they liked how mine looked and decided to refresh theirs too. By the weekend, half the street had new fences. The once dull neighborhood now looked lively, warm, and cared for. Karen was livid. She stormed down the street, arguing with anyone who would listen. "You can't all change your fences at once," she snapped. "This isn't a free-for-all." But no one listened this time. People were tired of her control. Later that evening, as the sun set, she came to my house again. "You started this," she hissed. "You think you can turn the neighborhood against me?" I stood calm, watching her frustration bubble over. "No," I said quietly. "I think people just remembered this is their home, not yours." Her jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She turned without another word and walked away faster than before. The next morning, a letter appeared in every mailbox. HOA meeting, mandatory attendance Saturday evening. When Saturday came, the community center was packed. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering and watching Karen at the front table. She cleared her throat, holding her notes with trembling hands. "We need to restore order," she began, her voice sharp. "This neighborhood is falling apart because some people think rules don't apply to them." The murmurs grew louder, people shaking their heads. One man stood up and said, "We followed the rules, Karen. We just painted our fences." Another woman said, "We pay our dues. We keep our homes clean. What more do you want?" Karen's voice cracked as she tried to respond, but the crowd's frustration drowned her out. For years, she had ruled with fear and fines. Now, the people she controlled were finally speaking. I looked at the quiet house, the fading sunlight painting soft shadows across the yard. Maybe it is I said, but my voice carried a hint of something deeper. Because sometimes stories like this never really, and they just fade into the calm before something new begins. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood settled into a rhythm of peace that felt almost unreal. No more notes taped to doors, no more surprise inspections, no more whispers of fines. The lawns stayed green, the fences stood strong, and the air felt lighter than it had in years. Tom proved to be a fair and patient HOA president. He listened to everyone, treated people kindly, and reminded the community that rules were meant to keep harmony, not fear. For the first time, people gathered for barbecues and helped one another without worry of being watched. I spent most evenings on my porch watching the sunset wash over the wooden fence that had started it all. It glowed in the fading light, warm and peaceful, just like the neighborhood around it. One afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It had no return address, but I recognized the neat handwriting immediately. Inside was a single piece of paper with only a few words written on it. "I was wrong. Take care of the place for me." I stood there for a long moment, letting the wind move gently through the trees. Karen had left more than just rules behind. She had left a reminder of what happens when control replaces community and how easily it can all fall apart. As evening fell, I looked around at the street. Children playing near the driveways, neighbors talking across lawns. Laughter and life had returned to every corner. I leaned back in my chair, the sound of the crickets rising as the sun slipped beyond the horizon. The fence stood strong and calm, its color deep and steady against the twilight. And in that quiet moment, I finally felt it. The peace I had imagined when I first moved here. A peace no one could take away ever again.